All right, hi everyone. Today is July 10th, 2019. This is the bi-weekly SIG cloud provider meeting. So one announcement before we start on the agenda. The proposal to fold all of the provider-specific SIGs, so AWS, Azure, GCP, IBM, OpenStack, and VMware, that is going to be happening July 12th, so that's this Friday. The plan was to allow those SIGs to fold into sub-projects under SIG Cloud Provider by July 12th, and any of the remaining SIGs by this Friday. We're just gonna update the community repo to kind of just consolidate all the SIGs as sub-projects then. So this is just kind of like the last FYI before we do that on Friday. If you have any questions on this, feel free to ping me on Slack and I can fill you in on any context you might be missing. All right, so first item on the agenda is 1.16 planning. So like last time, what I'm gonna do is go over all the existing items on the backlog. We're going to set a milestone, either 1.16 or next. So 1.16 meaning we're gonna try to tackle it for this release cycle, and next meaning we're gonna punt it for some future release in the future. And then we have 4 priorities: P0, P1, P2, P3. P0 means, generally P0 and P1 are items we should really get done for this release. P2, P3, nice to get done, but not absolutely critical. Okay, so let's go oldest to newest. First item is GA and cloud provider node labels. So I have a PR open for this. This is the proposal to migrate the beta labels for instance type, zone, and regions for nodes to the GA labels, which is topology.kubernetes.io/zone region and instance type. So I think this is P1, and we should probably start working on it for 1.16. Folks agree?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. There was some worth noting that I had a talk with Michelle from SIG Storage because PVs also use those beta zone region labels. And so we may actually, the initial plan was to do them separately. Sorry, the initial plan was to migrate them both in the same release, but we might actually do it separately because the PVs are going to be migrated to use the node affinity field instead of labels. So we're going to go ahead and update the nodes and then worry about PVs separately. Okay, cool. Next one is investigate alternatives for out-of-tree PV labeling. So last release, we said this was P1. I think P2 is actually better for this one because, like I just mentioned, PVs are not going to be using labels in the future for node affinity. And so I think there's less of an incentive for providing an out-of-tree solution for PV labeling. So the initial plan was to have an out-of-tree emission controller that would do the same thing as the persistent volume label emission controller in tree. But I don't think it's as high of a priority. So I'm gonna push this to P2. Folks agree? All right. And I'm actually gonna put this to the next milestone. Not this one. Okay. All right. AWS docs for the cloud provider integration or CPI. Mike, you're assigned to this one. I know you said you're sick. Can you just get a thumbs up or a thumbs down or a +1 in chat if you're going to work on this or not? Or if we need to change the priority?
That might be one for Jay to comment on. I know he's done some thinking about this. Sorry to put you on the spot, Jay.
No worries at all. Nice to meet everybody. Hey, I'm Jay. Yeah, I'm happy to take this over and drive it.
Cool. What's your GitHub handle?
Jpipes, Jaypipes.
Cool. All right, and P0 for 116. Are you okay with that, or do you like? Well, how are you doing in terms of like time commitment for this one?
Yeah, that's good. That's good
Okay.
for me. Not, then I can find resources internally to help.
Okay, awesome.
Mm-hmm.
If you want like references, let me know. I know a few of the providers have already written docs, so I can point you to those to get a sense of like what generally like what those docs should look like.
Absolutely, that'd be great. Thanks.
All right, so same thing for GCE. What priority do we want to set for GCE docs this release?
We can commit to that one for this release.
Okay, so P0, 116?
P1?
P1?
Yeah.
Cool. OpenStack, is anyone from OpenStack here? I don't think so, so we'll skip this one. This is better cloud LB names.
Is there a corresponding issue for Azure, or are we?
I think the Azure one got closed.
Great.
Yeah, I think there was docs written for it, so it was closed. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks.
Better cloud LB names. So right now, all the load balancers created by the cloud provider uses the default like service UUID name. There were some issues upstream or in KK around providing some mechanism to add more descriptive names. It's a complex problem because we have to account for like the existing LBs, and some providers allow renaming, some providers don't, and so it's a bit of a thorny problem. This was P3 milestone next in 115. I think given the current priorities, I think P3 next also makes sense here. It's a nice to have, but it doesn't really change functionality wise for a lot of things. Okay, silence is acceptance, so I'll keep going. Kube controller manager to cloud controller manager migration cap. So this was the cap that the extraction migration subproject was working on, which was to have a way for like a coordinated leader election between the KCM and CCM. So we have a better story for how to migrate HA clusters to use CCM. In 116 or in 115, that slipped because we missed the cap deadline. So I think P0 for 116 makes sense. We'll try to get API machinery to approve this cap as early as possible. Okay, next one. Investigate usage requirements for cluster ID. So the cluster ID functionality, I think that's only used by the AWS provider right now. It's a way for doing resource management on the control plane, where you can pass the control plane like a certain tag to use across all the managed resources. I think this ticket was created just to figure out if we want to deprecate cluster ID or if we want to enforce cluster ID across all the providers. I think it's in a weird state right now where the KCM warns if the cluster ID isn't set, because we had assumed that all the providers would set it eventually. But then I think it's still AWS that's only setting it, so we should do some cleanup there. How do folks feel about this one? Should we just punt this for next?
Maybe we should come back to this next week and let a couple of the cloud providers do some homework.
Yeah, I was just going to say I haven't looked at cluster IDs, so I can't comment on it.
Sure.
And I will add it to SIG AWS topics for Friday's meeting.
Okay. Cool. So I tagged the both of you here. So okay, I'm gonna leave this for milestone next though, and then let's continue conversation on this issue.
Yeah,
All right.
maybe a recurring agenda item, just because if we put it in milestone next and then don't do anything, we'll just be in the same place
Yeah.
forever.
Okay, so yeah, maybe we'll allocate a chunk of some next meeting time to talk about this in more depth. But yeah, if Jay and Craig, if you can do some research on your end for AWS and Azure, we can figure out what to do next for this one. All right, credential provider cap. So I know Mike Root, you're doing some work to write a cap for what we want to do for the in-tree credential providers. Mike, do you want to give us a quick update on this one?
Sure. Let's keep this P0 for 116. I think I can land it.
Okay, cool. All right, investigating API throttling and node controller. So this came up. So some of the engineers from Alibaba Cloud were running into node throttling issues with their APIs because the node controller was too aggressive in the way it was updating the node addresses. This is only for, so this is you only run into this if you have a large enough cluster and it depends on the API throttling settings on your account. So I don't know how widespread this is, but it seems like low priority until we can figure out if it's a common enough issue. Are people and other providers running into this at all?
So we're running into it for large clusters in Azure.
Okay.
This is throttling of a cloud provider API?
Yeah. Because the node updates have to, it's a one API call per node address update, even if the node addresses aren't updated.
I think it's a reasonable thing to investigate. I know Alibaba has done some customization both in the etcd and the scheduler to get to large clusters with low pod numbers. So they're sort of outside the typical envelope.
Right. So how about we say like P1 for 116 only to investigate like how bad of a problem it is, and then for 117 we can start scoping out solutions.
That sounds reasonable.
I'd be reasonable load test to add, for example.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, yeah, same thing for routes API. Let's do P1 because it's pretty much the same problem. And with dual stack, it'll be interesting how this changes, but we should look into this. Okay. Finalize protection for service load balancers. Mr. Hone, I don't know his actual name. Zihong from SIG Network has picked this up. So this is mostly just a tracking issue at this point. So this adds finalizer protection for load balancers so that if the service controller crashes during a delete operation, we can still garbage collect it when the service controller comes back up. And so this was alpha in 115. It's going to be beta 116. So I think we can just leave this P1 for 116. API server network proxy. Walter, you want to give an update on this one?
Sure. So KEP is approved. There is an outstanding PR, which I will add to this tracking. But there's a PR for adding usage of the network proxy, deploying of the network proxy to the GCP cloud provider as a sample and getting it to be used for the logs sub-resource. Once that merges, I will turn around and get it for all of the other resources that are outward bound calls from the Kube API server. So I'm expecting this to land in in an alpha form in 1.16.
Okay, cool. So alpha 1.16. Right. Okay, and that's still P0, right?
Yeah, that is P0.
Cool. Investigate support for multiple route tables. Right. So this is to be able to configure. So this is to change the CPI to handle multiple routing tables. Like, so adding nodes to, I guess, a routing table versus like by an annotation or something. I don't know. I don't know what the design would be, but do we feel like this is a common enough use case by the other cloud providers to look into? Seems like it might need more discussion.
Yeah, do we have sort of a usage story, like when this is desirable?
I'd have to read this in more detail. So okay, why don't we ask Alibaba to provide more use cases, and then we can judge it based on that. So I'm going to put it in next for now.
Sounds good.
Okay, decoupling cloud providers from the Kubernetes E2E testing framework. So the testing common subproject under SIG testing is doing some refactoring work to move the E2E testing framework to staging. And a part of that is going to try to decouple the cloud provider framework inside the E2E testing framework out of there as well. And this is we're gonna need that when we start removing the entry cloud providers. Otherwise, we still have the vendor dependencies, even though we remove the cloud providers. And so this is a work in progress by SIG testing, but there's really not much we can do about it now until some of the refactoring work by SIG testing gets done. So I think P1 for milestone next seems reasonable. Okay. Defining requirements for cloud config. So this came up 115 because there were some concerns around how we don't document like API requirements for how we change the cloud config file that the providers use to toggle, various integrations and features. I think the action item here was to just document it somewhere, or document, like add a comment in the cloud config struct for each provider to say what the API guarantees are, so that we don't have people breaking those guarantees by accident. Fabio or Justin, are you on the call? Can you follow up on this for 116? Okay.
So I couldn't find my unmute button.
Okay, sounds good. Tracking underlying cloud resources for services. Let me open this issue. Service objects should be annotated by cloud providers to track underlying resources. Right, so I think this was a feature request to, add a provider ID to the load balancer status. So it's easier to track what that load balancer is. I think this might need a cap. I don't know. Do folks have thoughts on this one?
It's not changing any fundamental capabilities, right? So why would it need a cap? It's just adding.
I think if you add a field to a V1 object, you still need to have a cap.
Okay, so okay, I'm gonna leave this as P2 next. I don't think there's enough. So it seems like Alibaba wants it. I think Timo, it seems like there's some valid use cases for it for DO. So if we can get enough folks to chime in and outline what those use cases are, then we'll bump this into the 116 milestone. So I'll reach out to Alibaba. Actually, I'll do it right now. CMD Cloud Control Manager should be easier to consume. So I think this came up because the outer tree providers are still vendoring K8s.io/Kubernetes, and this is mainly because it needs to import CMD/Cloud Controller Manager. So I think, I don't know, like I feel like we need to start somewhere to either move the Cloud Controller Manager to staging or just migrate it to an external repo so that we don't require imports to K8s.io/Kubernetes. I think the tricky part here is that Cloud Controller Manager has to import the controllers so that it also requires moving the controllers with it. So that'll be the tricky part because the Kube Controller Manager still imports it.
Yeah, and in fact, I think we should really think through it because I agree it needs to import the controllers, but the set of input controllers it needs to import probably varies by cloud provider. So we probably want to make sure that we can import the framework in such a way that it's easily, the set of controllers is easily extended. And that may just be one example. If we need to worry about things like which flags need to be passed in because some cloud provider needs a specific flag for the CCM, that should also be something that is easy to override. So I think we should sit down, write up the story of how this should work, and then work towards that.
I agree with Walter. There's also another issue, I think. It's that the controllers are currently using the internal types. So if we move the controllers, we need to switch to version types also.
Mm-hmm. In fact, they should never have been using internal types, but that's just further making your point.
Okay, so it seems like it needs more thought. I'm going to try to, let me edit this issue and try to make it a bit more actionable. Maybe we just need to like think about design more. So let me get back to this one. I'm going to do milestone next for now, though.
Maybe shift it to an agreed on plan in 116. Like, again, I am concerned that if we don't have some forcing function, we'll just end up in the same place in 3 months.
I agree. I think we should have a story and have outlined what all of the issues are that we want to solve and how we plan to solve them.
Maybe we can add it to 116 and start thinking through the design. And maybe if we have time to work on it, we'll work on it.
Sure, that sounds good. Okay, so let's do design for 116. Okay. I'll update the issues after the meeting. I don't want to spend meeting time doing that. Do we want P2 for 116?
Sure.
Cool. Support of instance metadata service. This puts no permission. So I think this is requesting like an out of tree metadata service, which goes back to the API throttling problem, right?
Seems to be.
Right, okay, so I remember. So I had recommended that we should prioritize making the controllers more API quota sensitive before we dig into like designing something like this. So how about we put this as next, and then we should go back to the other issues around API throttling and bump priority on those.
It seems like maybe there's a missing overall cap with the goals of some of these changes that relate to each other. And so there are more granular specific requests, but it's kind of missing the context of what we're trying to accomplish with all of these together.
Yeah. that I agree. I think it's good though so the reason why I tell people to open issues is because then we get more data points on like, I'd rather see like multiple duplicate issues by multiple providers, so we have more feedback on what those issues are. And so it seems like API throttling is coming up quite often. Wondering if that needs to be higher priority for 116. Craig, I think I saw you put your hand up.
I think he left.
Oh, okay. Oh, he must have been waiting then. Yeah, okay. So yeah, why don't we, let me talk to folks at Azure and Alibaba and ask them about how big of an issue this is for larger clusters. And if folks and other providers run into this, please let me know and we can prioritize this correctly.
Yeah, I mean, that having been said, I think keeping a bunch of open issues is perfectly reasonable, but I think when we get enough of them, to Jago's point, it suggests that it's time to start gathering it, coming up with designs and discussing alternatives. And so maybe the fact that we have this many issues means it is time to, begin discussing, how they all hook together, what the story is, and what our design options are.
Okay, so it seems like we need an action item once we collect enough user feedback to get into design phase.
Yeah.
And start working on KEPs and whatnot.
Exactly,
Okay.
and it seems like there are definitely a couple of alternatives on how we deal with this, so I would like to begin that discussion.
Okay. Sounds good. Yeah, let me put more thought into it. And yeah, let's talk offline about that one. Because I feel like that's a longer discussion we need to have.
Yep.
Handle nodes that are shut down. Yassine, you want to give us an update on this one?
Yes, so we're still working on the cap. I saw that you added a reference. So we are having some commitment from folks that are reviewing this. So I'd add it to 116.
Okay. So cap for 116. Do you have a priority you want to set for this?
Given the number of issues that are under KK that are referencing this problem, I would add it as a P1.
Okay.
Have we discussed this with SIG node?
Yes, they're in the loop, and
Okay.
David and Yuju are reviewing.
Awesome.
Cool. Validate test usage of service account credentials in Cloud Controller Manager. Backlog issue for this one. Okay, I think this is fine as next. Yeah, I don't think we need to prioritize this. It would be nice to have tests for this, but we haven't had tests for like how many releases, I don't know.
Well, the other thing I will mention to that, if it seems like eventually this is going to end up in cloud provider repos. So I'm not even sure that we need a generalized test. This may just be something that can be left to the cloud providers to test.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, I'll put it an action item for myself to revisit this one. Yeah, it might be better just to close this entirely. All right, this one is update K8s.io / cloud provider sample. So a few releases ago, Walter created a cloud provider sample repo, and we're going to use it as a way to, like, the canonical example of implementing a cloud provider. So this slipped our radar for the last two releases. Do we want to prioritize working on this for 116? Do we have the cycles to do that?
I would love to at least get something like a test grid integration, because I think that's one of the blocking items for a lot of the entry providers. And so I think having, working out how to solve that and providing a sample is going to be pretty important if we're going to make progress.
Do we actually have the cycles though, to Andrew's point?
No,
Do you have an owner for this one?
That's my problem, is I don't have an owner right now, but I think that if we don't make progress, it's going to be hard for a lot of other things to make progress. I would say let's keep it in, but make it a P2, and let's see if we can find an owner.
Okay. Anyone else on the call want to take this one? Going once? Going twice?
I can maybe take a look at this. I'm just not familiar with like how deep you need to be into like the test infrastructure. That's something that I haven't really touched yet. So if like somebody would be around to basically give me a hand and give me some guidance, then I can do that. You can understand.
I don't have the background, but I'm going to need to get it. So feel free to reach out to me and we can at least work together on it.
Sounds good. Cool.
Let me tag you on this one. Cool. Thanks, Timo. Removing unnecessary flags in Cloud Controller Manager. So Timo helped us figure out all the flags. So okay, so some context. So in 1.14, 13, there was a bunch of refactoring work to consolidate some of the code we use with KCM and CCM, and that ended up adding a bunch of flags from the KCM into the CCM that aren't necessarily needed. So Timo did some extra work to figure out what those flags are, and we should go back and remove the ones that aren't actually needed in the CCM. Timo, do you have time this cycle to work on this one as well?
Yeah, I can totally do that. Especially, I think, since you did a first pass and basically came to the conclusion that most flags should still be needed. I think in my last comment, I asked some more clarifying questions, so that basically, I guess, mostly for me to gain a better understanding on why some of these flags are needed. But yeah, as soon as I think we like have agreement or confirmation on what's really needed and what can be kicked out, I'm happy to at least try to move this forward.
Okay, let's do 1.16 P2. I'll follow up with you on your comment here.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, Cloud.
Yeah, bravo on getting that work done.
Cloud Controller Manager should be able to ignore nodes. So this came up from one of the engineers working on virtual kubelet, where they want to set some sort of annotation so that the CCM just ignores the node. In this case, the node being the virtual kubelet. Folks have opinions on this one? It seems like a pretty niche use case, so I was thinking just putting a milestone next until we have more user feedback on this one.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay. Standardizing the Cloud Controller Manager build release process. Yeah, it's a big one. So I feel like we've had conversations in past KubeCons around like how do you build and push the CCM image per provider. I feel like now that we're getting more providers actually developing the CCM and running in production environments, I feel like we need to start having design discussions around the actual like standardizing on some sort of process for how to do builds. I know, Walter, you looked into this a bit with GCE.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk with people. I have some pretty strong opinions on this. I think this also ties into things like the cloud provider sample and, in fact, each of the individual cloud provider repos.
You can ping me on this, Walter. I can help.
Awesome. You'll excuse me. I heard the I didn't see who said that.
It's Yassine.
Oh, hey, Yassine. Okay.
Hey, Yassine, can I assign this to you then for 1.16?
Yeah.
Let's do 1.16, and let's put how do we feel about P1? Not to get the build process defined, but to just have discussion and at least come to a consensus as a SIG on what it might look like going forward.
Seems reasonable to me.
Yeah, I agree. This is important.
Right. Nodes intermittently lose their node addresses. Let's go here. Okay, I remember this one. I think this one is actually, I think it's actually safe to close this one. It's a fixed issue and it was reopened because someone had a misconfigured cluster. So I'll follow up and close this one. Allow discovering node changes for load balancer targets more frequently. Timo, you want to give us a quick update on this one?
Yeah, sure. So that's pretty new. I just filed this like 20 minutes before the meeting, and I only discovered this or gained some insights on this one today. So I'm very happy for any insights or feedbacks that you might have on this one. So the story behind this is that I looked at how often load balancers are updated with regards to the nodes that they can send traffic to. And based on what I discovered, there's basically a period, it's called node sync period, and this is like a constant fixed to 100 seconds. So to my understanding, that means that even though nodes could already be added or removed, it could still take another delay of 100 seconds for that update to be propagated to cloud load balancers. And the question that I wanted to raise is if this would be something that we could consider to make configurable one way or another, or at least somehow consider options to reduce the latency that goes around this. All assuming that my understanding of what the current situation is in this regard is actually correct.
Does the service controller not have a node watch? Like it only does the sync period. It doesn't do a watch.
I don't think so. There is a certain piece up front about like event resources being handled, but that is not used for updating the nodes with regards to load balancers that they send requests to. That is at least my understanding. So if you scroll further up, right, a bit more, I think. Right, so I'm not sure if you referred to this one. There's like at line 137, there's like lots of add functions and update and delete functions, but that's not used for this particular piece. That's used to ensure load balancers that they are created, that they are being deleted, but I don't think it's being used to update the list. That is what a different routine is for in the run method.
Gotcha. Yeah, I have a feeling that the node watch is probably left out intentionally because of the frequent updates to node objects.
There's the heartbeat that happened recently. Is this related?
I think it would change. I think it would mean that maybe watching nodes might be viable for a service controller, but I'm not entirely sure. Okay, so how about we do, how about for 116, we should investigate possible solutions for this. So either make the node resync period configurable somehow, or add the node watch in the service controller. Because if it's in the KCM, like it's already doing a node watch for other things, so maybe doing a node watch there wouldn't be so bad. I think the tricky part is actually figuring out like if a node event requires updates to a load balancer resource, because I feel like most of the time a node update event wouldn't. So I think that's the part we need to consider. So let's do 116p3, and let's chat offline around possible solutions for this.
Sure.
All right, I think that was all the issues. Let me double check. Yep, that was all of it. folks want to add anything last minute to our backlog for 116? We're good? Okay, cool. All right, instrumentation in the Cloud Controller Manager. Han, I think you put this in there.
Yeah, I turned on my video. Okay. But I'm going to use your mic. So that's yeah, so this came up in SIG instrumentation. I'm here on behalf of SIG instrumentation. We have been doing a bunch of work on metrics in the Kubernetes codebase. And in doing so, we have been auditing metrics in the various binaries. And it seems like the metrics in legacy cloud providers currently kind of all over the place. There's no, I don't know if there is a plan for standardizing any of this moving forward, given that this cloud provider thing is moving forward, and that seems to be the general intent of the SIG. So I thought it would be prudent to come here and to sort of raise the issue and start a discussion or have people start thinking about this, if this is something that may be in scope for this project.
Yeah, I think it might be useful to step back and give some context around what the emerging conversation on metrics in Kubernetes project as a whole is. And recently there was a discussion in the KEP around how metrics being emitted is actually part of the API surface area. We can't just change it without broad communication and deprecation policies and related.
Yes.
So I think that would be helpful to set the context for
Sure.
what does the cloud provider SIG need to pay attention to and plan for.
Sure. So yeah, there have been a number of issues with metrics over the past few releases. Specifically, a lot of metrics have been changed, which cause ingestion breakages. And so there is a new initiative to fix the root of that problem so that we can avoid breaking ingestion pipelines for metrics. Yeah, that involves basically what Jago was saying, treating metrics properly like an API. And for the case of cloud controller or controller manager and the legacy cloud providers, each of the cloud providers currently do seem to have their own set of metrics. They currently seem to presume Prometheus. In fact, the cloud provider repo that you guys were doing the 116 thing on, it seems also to use, tangentially use Klog. And I don't know if this was like an intentional decision, but I know that there is also some discussion about moving away from Klog. And so if that was the case, then basically, I mean, if you want to use Klog, that should be like an explicit choice, right?
No,
otherwise it's going to be dragged in everywhere.
It was just a substitute for glog to klog happen. I don't think
No, there's a structured logging thing that people were talking about, moving off of Klog.
No, I understood.
Yeah.
But I mean, the going to Klog
yeah.
was part of someone's initiative to move off of glog.
Right. No, yeah.
We were the a side effect of that. There was no deliberate decision. We moved to Klog because that's where Kubernetes was going at the time.
Right, except this means that all the cloud providers will be forced to use Klog or glog. In the previous case, it would be glog, but they would be forced to use this specific logging thing. And that might not necessarily be desirable. If so, then I feel like that should probably be a conscious decision.
I think you can be more firm with us. We'd love guidance. If you say, it sounds like you're not saying you're crazy if you use Klog, you should use this instead. But
it's a contentious issue.
Okay.
And I think Tim Hawkins has this thing on logging interface, which I think he has been trying to push forward to replace Klog with.
Again,
Yeah.
if if the Kubernetes community says, hey, we have a interface, we will happily switch to that, but we are basically following the community.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to bring it up because I wanted to start some discussion around this.
Absolutely. On the not breaking the metrics API, one interesting point would actually be this KCM to CCM migration. I do not have a concrete example, but when we move controllers from the KCM to the CCM, I imagine that there are going to be metrics that disappear from the KCM and will then appear in the CCM. And so, I mean, we would love guidance on how to make that safe.
And being completely transparent in terms of instrumentation, like I don't think it's been something that's been on my radar, at least. I think instrumentation was just added pretty ad hocly a long time ago, and we just kind of is just there. So yeah, same boat as Walter. Like I feel like instrumentation wise, we would just follow what the community goes towards. And I think I would say this is true for the out-of-tree providers too, because they're just vendoring in what we have in KK. So I think if we update KK like the way we do metrics there, then the other providers would just follow naturally.
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated than that because currently the different cloud providers have different sets of metrics, right? So given sort of the abstraction of cloud provider, cloud controller manager, I mean, things would have to be reworked, right? Like metrics would have to be genericized across cloud providers.
Well, I think there's a distinction between what is being emitted as metrics and how that is being emitted.
There can be, yeah, well, that's true, but you would think that there would be a common set of things that are also emitted across.
Okay. So
I think there is there's a union, but there's also a disjoint, right? Sure. So the CCM specifically, there's probably 60% overlap, which every cloud provider specific CCM emits, and then the remaining 40% is probably going to be cloud provider specific.
Right.
We see if someone on the call has something to add.
I was going to say that we have 2 more agenda items and we only have 9 minutes. So
yeah, so I just wanted to bring it up for discussion so that people would start thinking about it. I will bring this back to SIG interpretation and see what people think. And
the other thing is we know we're across some of our extraction work and other things are cross-cutting. So, I mean, I would actually suggest that Yassine has offered to do sort of the CCM build, and that it would be great if we could get someone from SIG instrumentation to show up to at least one of those meetings so that we can do some planning, some like boots on the ground planning.
For the build?
Yeah. So if you want to do how we're going to do core and backward compatibility checking and how we're going to handle the disjoints and maybe compatibility checking specific to the cloud provider, then I would suggest that that meeting is the right place to actually do that planning.
Sure.
So how about as an action item, we assign someone in the SIG to take point on some of the instrumentation work, and then feed that back to the providers to make sure that we're following some set standards for metrics.
That sounds like a reasonable action item.
Anyone on the SIG want to take that?
We have Walter's hand waving in front of the screen here.
All right, cool. So yeah, Walter will take point on that, and then we'll continue discussion in the next meeting or future meeting.
Yeah, I think that's a good plan.
Okay. Next item is KubeCon NA sessions by Fabio.
Yeah, this was like 2 things. One is the follow-up on the, since we have the folding of the SIGs on July 12, which is, I believe, this Friday. do we have any news on the potential submission for a sub-project of cloud provider? I know that Dan Cohn replied on the original thread on GitHub, but I don't know if there were any back channeling and or side chats about this. This is the first thing. The second thing is, are we proposing anything for SIG cloud provider for KubeCon North America? I guess.
So on the topic of the per provider talks, yeah, the only back channeling was I was talking to Ihor and some folks in steering. It's on most people's radar. That is going to be coordinating those 6 sessions. So I think we're good. But once we do the updates to SIG.YAML, I'm going to loop back with Dan Cohn and make sure that everything's in line so that all the subprojects have their sessions for KubeCon San Diego. But yeah, I'll put an action item for myself to give an update specifically for that in the next SIG meeting.
Yeah, Andrew, as far as I know, they've traditionally sent out invites to SIG chairs for a special KubeCon submit procedure, but I don't believe that's gone out yet at all to anybody. At least nobody I know has received one.
Yeah, it's typically like a few weeks after the CFP closes.
Yeah, and on that one for SIG Cloud Provider, it's not a cloud provider specific, but I know Yassine has a deep dive topic having to do with all of the gotchas for cloud providers who want to set up a new cloud provider and get a cloud provider specific build and deployment going. And if his CFP doesn't actually go through, I would suggest that would be a great deep dive for our SIG.
Okay, so for NA, do we want to do like 2 sessions this time? Like 1 intro, 1 deep dive?
Sure.
That's reasonable to me.
Be a well-attended KubeCon, so I think we can make use of the time.
Okay, and if folks want to present on behalf of the SIG, let me know and I can try to coordinate there. Okay, so 5 minutes left. Aldo, you wanted to talk about instance host labeling. Sorry about not giving you more time on this one. But yeah, go for it.
Yeah, hi. No, that's okay. I don't need much time. I just wanted to introduce myself. And well, we are working mostly on SEG scheduling. So what we want to eventually have is pods spreading at different topologies. We already have 2 topologies, zone and region, but we want to add also instance host. So we are pursuing this CAP that is linked in the doc. And basically, at this point, we only want agreement in 2 things. Where the first thing is that we actually need this label and what's the name for it. So the CAP is already there, the justification, and so we just want your input, and yeah, discussion can happen there.
Okay, sounds good. I think there was some, I remember the mailing list thread on this one was quite contentious because there was discussions around if the instance host label should be a provider specific topology or a codified topology in Kubernetes.
Yeah, the main selling point would be that there are customers that have on-prem clusters and also cloud. So if they can use a unified label, their YAMLs could be more portable. So that's basically the idea. I know the discussion was a little bit unclear on that part, so I'm just hoping that the CAP or the pull request is the best place to get the discussion going.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, folks.
So if you have any other suggestions on how to proceed, I'll be glad to hear. Otherwise, yeah, that's it for me.
Cool. Any questions on that one? So yeah, please provide feedback in the cat PR if you have comments. Cool. So with that, we're out of time. So we'll end here. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Bye.
But